Hello, my name is Dr. Stephen Bujno, and this is the lecture on critical theory, personhood, and conflict. This will be quite an overview. I would even say an oversimplification. Perhaps, in the words of G.K. Chesterton, something worth doing is worth doing badly. What that means is that it would take a whole course in order to really ferret out some of these ideas, but it's still worth presenting, even if it's maybe coming across as an oversimplification. I would imagine that some people might take umbrage at a few of the ways that I present some of these thinkers. Maybe not if I had a chance to elaborate a little bit more. But nonetheless, when we talk about the philosophical heritage that critical theory has sprung from, let's just say that first off, this is not a uniform set of conditions. It's not a fixed body of knowledge. There's a lot of debates, both from within critical theory and from without, how these various strains have endured over the years. So again, I'm going to include many thinkers, philosophers, and they themselves have evolved in their thinking, early Freud to later Freud and such. But I'm hoping that this is a fair representation and encompasses, all the similar theoretical interests that at least can help us lead to understand exactly what critical theory is. So first off, what it purports to explain is that it's trying to give the truest explanation of social and political events. Now, what I mean by that is it's trying to do so in terms of a philosophical understanding of justice and also societal happiness. So it's after some universal standard of evaluation. Now, when you have something in the background that's universal and standard like that, there's always a certain suspicion where these commonly held views of justice and happiness, could quite frankly just be naively appealed to. Now, that naive appeal, and I'll explain more as I go along, might be considered, at least by critical theorists, as an ideology. Now, the reality is that I've talked about ideologies in the past, maybe defined as a non-epistemic stance, which means that it was not arrived at through some logic or discursive reasoning. But here, the ideology is going to be that which underlies the very thing that influences us, sort of unbeknownst to us. It might make more sense, as I go along. Now, the reality is that if you're just going to shoot for ideals towards justice and happiness, they're going to be far too utopian, and they're not really capable to respond to real conditions in society. If you want to think about medical ethics, the various, say, principles, non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, and autonomy, might be guidelines or guardrails, but even those still tend not to be as practical as what happens, directly in, say, concord with the patient. But they seem to be a little more practical in medical ethics than, say, virtue theory or natural law theory that had the principles are more internal dispositions than guidelines and such. Anyway, so the idea here is, again, to respond to these real conditions in society. So critical theory is going to attempt to show the truth of justice and happiness, which are only implicit in the philosophical ideals that have proposed them prior. So this is what they would call, and we can understand as the theory practice problem of critical theory. There's this logical consistency, deductive reasoning, scientific calculations, and most of all, reason's reliance on religion for public morality. Okay, all of that is what has gotten society into its rational consistency and, we would say, utility. But they've ceased to work in society. So Catholic social teaching almost would see an abrasion with this. So we're not going to develop this today, but from a Catholic social teaching point of view, you would find a different view of the human person and then how that person relates to society. You're going to see here with critical theory that it's much more of an emancipatory view. So it's a taking down of those things that are opposed to bringing what they would consider justice or a correction of the Enlightenment ideals that were never realized. Okay. So anyway, critical theory is going to arise to criticize, the very culture, like from what it came from. So there's sort of a paradox here, and it also always places it in some sense of crisis. It criticizes the climate with which it lives and both how it was influenced. So the societal climate here, we might remark that it's like all of that, what we will then term hegemony, is almost like a state-imposed dictatorship. So it's maybe easy to understand if you can think of it as a tyranny of a democratic majority. So just because it's what the majority wills, then that is imposed on others. Therefore, this then becomes an issue that requires emancipation. So it's trying to seek true goals. And the ideal would be utopian, and the real, those are the conditions within society. Okay, so the Enlightenment. Now, if you recall, the Enlightenment reacted to religious underpinnings of politics and morality. So it used to be the way of God, and that was intended to be overtaken by the way the world goes. So religious authority gave way to reason itself, and reason was then to propel some sort of scientific and moral progress onward, and hope. And what the idea was is that this progress would bring us to some sort of moral and political emancipation of all persons. So reason became the essence of the self, and then nature, with all of its embedded laws and rules, became the grounds of the empirical or mechanistic science. So in the Enlightenment ideal, reason as the essence of the person, combined with this mechanistic science, there was always that tension then between a philosophical realism and a scientific realism. And the hope was with the Enlightenment that the self could come to know the laws of nature, and then those laws of nature reveal something and improve the lot of us here on Earth, which it has, but they would think that it would have been much more just in its in the conclusions that it reached, not just in theory but also in practice. And then think too, in terms of economic production, this led to specialization. Now, there's a certain irony here, a complex irony if you want to talk about it, how we went from very high-skilled labor to more generalized labor. So if you want to think of perhaps people working in their home that might have been shoemakers or seamstresses, and they were very good at what they did, and people would go to them in their house perhaps for their product to be made, and from the fitting to the selection of materials to the actual construction, and then finally making sure everything was right in the end when it was given to the consumer, that required skilled labor. But as specialization started to arise, you then saw, perhaps you might want to think of a small factory where now 10 to 20 women can come in for seamstress, or perhaps producing shoes. And there was no way for the person within, their own residence or a very small storefront, like house storefront economy, can exist in this. So it didn't require as much general knowledge and skilled labor. It required less skilled labor, but specialization, so maybe just skilled in one particular way. So there was a certain freedom here that was sacrificed in service to the others. So again, these skilled artisans, they were displaced by mechanistic means of production. So once you had machines in place, you no longer needed the skilled labor. You just needed unskilled labor in order to operate these machines. Now, this didn't quite start to access this view of, exactly how is it that the individual is going to go from this specialized, if you want to call it that, or maybe we should say that they're more skilled, to the specialized and a more generalized labor. It never really brought about the equality and the reciprocity that was hoped for. Immanuel Kant enters here, and we could probably throw in Jean-Jacques Rousseau too. So we're talking, late 1700s. Now, what their view of the human person was that they placed the individual self as this rational agent, and the rational agent was to create a society of that equality and reciprocity. If you remember the categorical imperative, or even we didn't go over it, but Rousseau's communitarianism, right? So this rationalism, we'll say, fostered like an intuitive epistemology. So in other words, the self could know. Now, the idea of an a priori epistemological claim, something that could be known prior to experience, was held as, conditions available to each person, right? So, in terms of morality, you could see Kant saying that I cannot will for myself what I cannot will for others at the same time. Uh, so, his view then was that this morality can be deduced through rational means, and maybe via capacity for self-introspection, if you want to call it that. Now, this was contrasted with David Hume's experimental epistemology, but Kant's system, it avoided dogmatic metaphysics. So again, Kant was trying to do his view of ethics by reason alone, and with not the what came prior to Enlightenment, this authoritative dogmatic view of religion. So he avoided dogmatic metaphysics and also Hume's experimental skepticism, because if you remember, with Hume, there was always that remember Hume's fork, the ideas and the facts. We won't revisit that. So the notion of individual freedom, this was taken directly from Kant's metaphysics. So there was this transcendent freedom of the individual, and it always was coupled with like a natural and historical causation. So those things we would call unnaturalism. But what happened was this still left quite a gap between moral theory and practice. So you should start already to be picking up the theme that critical theory has to be something that can be applied, quite practically in the end. Anything that's not going to quite fill that gap is going to leave some, let's just say the moral theory would be the idea of individual freedom, and the actual practice would be that of historical causation. And in the end, this obviously did not create the equality and reciprocity that they were hoping. So some people start to refer to this as the failed Enlightenment. Now, when you introduce Hegel, Hegel had this view that there was a certain reflection, this unfolding of ideas over the course of history, where the world, reflects its activity and such, and all of this becomes some sort of adaptation to the, let's say, to society. We'll leave it at that for now. But I do want to mention that this could be one link. When I said that you can't really, connect the dots with these, with Hegel, you could use him to link Kant's philosophy with Karl Marx, who will come next. And let me just say now that oftentimes when people hear of critical theory, they're typically hearing of critical race theory, and some of the accusations is that it's Marxist. Well, that's not necessarily true, and I'll explain why, but it also does have a connection to Marx, so it's one of those things where there's a little bit of truth in there, but you have to figure out exactly what that is. So anyway, this links Kant with Karl Marx's social theory. So history for Hegel is this unfolding of rational ideas that's implicit in social, political, and cultural institutions. But the human person, and remember, that's our focus here. We're seeing a little bit of change from the human person as reason with Kant. Here, the human person is not the rational self as it was with Kant, but now there's an identity that rises. And the identity for Hegel, the human person, is always the context of labor and social interaction. So this is Hegel's reflection. There's the continuous experience of this objective world out there that causally orders events. And there's like a reflection, or it mirrors, I should say, the unifying activity as us, as subjects, and as persons. So that mirroring is this eternal contemplation of our own external life. It's an adaptation, we would say, to the world's environment. So the goal, if you want to say, of this mirroring, this adaptation, it occurs in labor and social interactions. So there's an embodied activity that we have in society, and it externalizes itself as a material nature in society. And then we contemplate itself. This almost becomes like another. Now, I know this probably sounds a little too confusing, so hopefully you just get the gist of the kernel, we should say, of what Hegel's offering here. And this comes from his phenomenology of spirit. So he holds that these twin goals of the Enlightenment are rational identity and also freedom. And they're always achieved through these two things that just popped up on screen: mastery of nature and the elimination of social domination. So again, let me repeat that, because that's kind of important. That the twin goals of the Enlightenment, if they were rational identity and freedom, then how they are achieved is through the mastery of nature and also the elimination of any social domination. Now he further claims that a lack of self-knowledge in our part, this is really what drives desire. And this comes from his section in the phenomenology on consciousness. So he talks about some dialectical relation that arises within labor. And this is what was implicit in the desire of the self. So whatever like desire that we have, somehow it unfolds into labor. Now, if it helps to think about this, we do take pride in what we make. We take pride in what we do. So we might even think of it like I created this. So there is some realization there. That's not a stretch by any means. But he's going to say too, this also comes back and shapes ourselves. So the very thing that we create and contribute then comes back and also shapes us as individuals. Now, the reconciliation of this is where he says we're trying to assimilate our needs through technology and science. So this technology and science is almost an expression of those things which are our desires. But with the people that are oppressed, the sense of freedom in the self is challenged by this. So morality and ethics, they always occur in what we would say this production of ideas. We should say cultural ideas, not necessarily in material necessity. So the things that we're using for ourselves, whether it be shoes or dresses or such, it's not quite the same as the cultural ideas that might be oppressing us. And that seems to be pretty easy to understand. So there's always this tension between what he would offer as the real and also what he would perhaps, and I'll reiterate these, what he would call the ideal. The real is going to be understood as this apparent manifestation of truth. And the ideal is the truth in its essence. So there's a movement here for Hegel. It's like we start out in what he calls a stage of immediacy, right? This ideal really didn't quite take shape. So we're still striving for the truth in its essence. But it hasn't quite taken shape to what he would say it has not yet been externalized. So by his externalization, he's talking about how these particular ideals get articulated in culture and society, economic, political institutions. And then eventually, this externalization will become to some sort of reconciliation. Now, I'm going to just say something here. It's often said of Hegel. He himself never said it, but it might help you understand this, digest it a little easier. There's always this interplay through society of some thesis that's presented culturally and then an antithesis to that. So think of it as a dialectic. This is often referred to as the Hegelian dialectic. So you have a thesis and an antithesis that don't simply compromise, but they do form some sort of synthesis. And then from that synthesis, that then becomes a new cultural norm. And again, you have this antithesis and thesis and dialect. And so you could see almost like society progressing, but it's not, if you want a visual to help you understand it even better, it would be different than somebody saying like history kind of forms, or follows the path of a pendulum where it swings to one extreme, finds the centering, and then swings to another extreme and goes back and forth. You'd almost have to think of this as a pendulum, but as it's moving back and forth, the thesis and antithesis, it's going forward too, to some sort of synthesis. So anyway, I hope that helps. But he's trying to say that we impose moral and rational order on ourselves and on the world. And that's where this reason and freedom appear. But they don't appear to the end of history. So if the Enlightenment was talking about these ideals that were to be met, and Kant was trying to at least connect these via reason, you're going to see Hegel saying that these are some future expectations, a reconciliation where rational freedom and the ethical community, it's only an idea to be contemplated, and it will be accomplished at some future resolution, some period. Here's where Karl Marx comes in. Karl Marx just says this whole point of reconciliation fails. In fact, a very famous statement of his is that up till now, philosophers have only interpreted the world. In other words, told us what it was and how it was to be. He says, but really the point is to change it. So Marx held that his present condition is that as private property. He says the problem with private property is that it's always going to ensure private interest, and it's always then in that arena going to allow the state to designate the ethical order. So you could see here he understands the person as being subsumed into the state who designates ethical order. As with Kant, it was supposed to be reason itself that helped us determine the ethical order. So democracy, under the rubric for Marx, he finds democracy to be nothing but a pretext. It's the way that the wealthy are just going to keep extending their own class domination. And that they're going to do it under the rational guidance of advancing everybody's common interest. So what Karl Marx introduces is the idea that some conflict is necessary. In other words, if you want the one connection from critical theory to Marx, it is the idea of conflict theory. So, in other words, there has to be something to dislodge this tethering of whatever it is that constantly dominates us. So for Marx, ideas themselves were ideological manifestations, of what he called real socioeconomic forces. So it was transformed philosophy from what we'd call like a metaphysics into a social science. And now the idealistic critique of knowledge, like even in Kant or the thinkers before him, now is more of a materialistic critique of the political economy and such. So what he thought then was that the ideal communities envisioned by Hegel, with this dialectic going back and forth, he found that to be nothing more than, for Hegel, to be some sort of reconciliation between, say, church and state. In other words, Hegel would have held that the church and state could literally be one of the locations of reconciliation. But for Marx, those were just pretexts. And they were the continuations of the very ideology that has always perpetuated the status quo. So, forces of material production, that's what determines the course of history, not philosophical reflections. So now he's not going to look at a dialectic in the same way that Hegel is. He's going to say we need to look at history in terms of this materialism where, let's say, we'll just leave it at that the advances in religion, morality, and law, they just reflected advances in the economic and political sphere. So he's more interested in gearing in on the economic and political sphere than trying to find any sort of dialectic as Hegel did. So just to reiterate, his idealistic critique of knowledge, not his, but the previous idealistic critique of knowledge was converted by his thinking to a materialistic critique of political economy. So this historic materialism that he's known for. Again, it's just to reiterate that religion, morality, and law and such are going to do little more than to maintain the status quo. So what he had then understood as the issue was that there was a value of labor that was never realized. So this idea of profit, let's just say that the distinctions between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie was the proletariat, you could be defined as an individual who has nothing other than his labor to exchange. And then a proletariat handles all the capital, everything from money to the means of production. And the bourgeoisie is the one that has the excess capital that the laborer should be rising up against, because that should be, according to his views, injustice, something that the laborer gets and not that the capitalist gets. So mechanisms of exchange, for him, determine the flow and the value of all commodities. It could be human or non-human. So he thought, again, this leads to the distortion of the exchange value and the use value of labor. So production is social, but consumption is private. So there has to be some emancipatory aims of the Enlightenment which reflect contradictions within capitalism itself. So capitalism, according to him, must be abolished. And with it, if you can abolish capitalism, you can also abolish the theory-practice problem, because communism itself will overcome that. So socialism is to be the bridge to communism, and then communism will both join individual freedom and democratic community, and then go back to the top of the page. You see, once again, you can then achieve that justice and happiness that critical theory is intent on pursuing. So the idea of justice and happiness is only ever going to be evident if one can bridge the theory-practice problem, and the theory-practice problem is going to be with the um, elimination of capitalism. Now, one thing to throw in here that's very important is that a thinker, an Italian communist, Antonio Gramsci, who was put into prison by the fascists, and quite frankly, his writings are known as the prison letters. This Italian Marxist, he, he remains part of what's often referred to as the first generation of critical theory. So one might even say that it begins the transition from Marx. Everything was economic, and now you're going to see a transition to the cultural control of the human person. So people who came from Gramsci on are no longer going to focus exactly on this idea that history has to be looked at in terms of some sort of conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Gramsci's going to introduce the idea that it's really an inherently cultural conflict, and there's going to be some idea of, let's say, this construction of networks of power through knowledge. We'll get into that later. So he talks about this hegemony, and depending on your pronunciation of it, it's not wrong to call it hegemony. In fact, in some European countries, that's how it is pronounced. So anyway, hegemony, it speaks of the dominant ideology that upholds belief and interest of the ruling class. So again, it's this status quo idea. So there's always these things underneath us in culture that are controlling us, but we're never quite certain what those things are. So he's looking for something to speak to this inherent conflict involved in the construction of these networks of power. And this is a reinterpretation of all this, of ideology. So you have, a distinction between coercion and consent, right? They're alternative mechanisms of social power. So what you have is you have power with the state. You have power with the schools. You have power with the church. You have power with the mass media. You have powers with the nuclear families. And you could see that this is emancipatory. You're trying to overcome, because all of those structures are so embedded in society, and the hegemony is so therefore embedded within those structures that the only way to overcome these things is to basically break those down. So an overall transition from economic to cultural control of the human person. Now it's seen about these things, and the hegemonic class of both church, school, mass media, nuclear family, meet all of these, they have to be broken, right? Because these form some sort of consensus among civil society that doesn't really allow us to emancipate and overcome. And remember, he's still worried about the connections, or should we say, the lack of connection between moral theory and practice. So these are all the hotbeds. And this is why, to this day, critical theory in all its forms has a, let's say, it has a sense that there has been this involuntary submission that we have to overcome, and there's a revolutionary aspect to it, because you're always trying to ferret out these superstructures, because these superstructures have the locuses of power, and the only way to get over them is to focus on revolt. So you have to find some way to break the unity, because these are all the consent of the governed that are doing this. This is not the same as Marx's ideology, but it still has that notion of like social class as a determining factor. Now, the idea then of how this continues to progress is we're going to make a leap, not a leap, but a transition from Marx to Freud. The Frankfurt School was expelled from Geneva, exiled from Geneva, and from fascism, and found refuge in the United States, actually at Columbia University. So if you're familiar with the New School is if you want to call it, the reincarnation of the Frankfurt School. And they were quite critical of things Western. So in a sense, that's kind of good that you can come to a country and be hypercritical of that very country that you have sought refuge in. But nonetheless, the Frankfurt School is a group of intellectuals and academics, and we're talking here maybe like 1920s and 30s and such. And you can see just that'd be prior to World War II coming around. But again, their Marxism made them sort of, is totally opposed to anything capitalistic, and the United States culture for them was tied to the promotion of capitalism. So the thought then from the Enlightenment position was that, again, this theory practice issue is not problematic, but the universal, well, it was problematic, but they were overcoming it here. But because the universal reasoning ability that we all have, our faculties, it was assumed to bring us to some sort of attainment of universal truths. But capitalism, remember, according to Marx, is not the resolution of that Hegelian dialectic. It actually, for us, he would say, becomes the source of our very alienation. So you can't have this thesis and antithesis going to some sort of synthesis. That itself is only going to perpetuate the static quo. Yes. So what he's really after here is to find out what exactly underlies the ideology that presents to us as a false consciousness. So if you've heard terms like political consciousness, national consciousness, you're going to start picking up on what they're trying to get at here. Okay, so Marx recognized that this class consciousness, for whatever reason for the proletariat, was lacking. Because, one of the disillusionments that Gramsci and other people that came after Marx was they could not figure out why the proletariat never rose up. That was the idea, that it was going to get so bad the proletariat would not put up with it and simply, revolt and overthrow the bourgeoisie, but it never happened. Some of it was, government and church aid, and probably even familial aid and such. In other words, they found ways to sort of just give them enough that they didn't get so mad, if you want to put it that way. So maybe you could talk about it as state intervention as one of the factors, right? And what that did was that tempered, if you want to say, the inner revolt that they should have had. Therefore, it never led to the external revolt against capitalism. So Marx's theory, for some, it was not closely identified anymore with the concern over raising political consciousness. They thought that was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. Remember, necessary is the thing that has to be there. So something of necessity could simply mean that if you want to get elected, you have to have a vote. But for sufficiency, you have to have enough votes. So they thought that political consciousness was necessary but not sufficient. So there was a need to turn to some psychological science, because there had to be some, they thought, intellectual dynamics that really underlie this ideological false consciousness that just keeps the proletariat from revolting or whatever else that's trying to be particularly overcome in this, in what they're trying to at least expel here. So what is that tenacious hold on the masses that will not allow them to revolt? So this brings in then Sigmund Freud. And if we keep in the back of our heads, before I get too much into Freud, about this happiness and justice that has to be realized in communism, Marx did hold that, again, that society has to pass through socialism to get to that communist state. So how to undermine it as a progressive force and to show that private property and profit, that those are really serious problems. So if he thought that a classless society was the practical answer, then a true democrat, and that would also be a true democratic state where all would receive what they needed regardless, right? So here you could, if anybody knows anything of the Bolshevik Revolution, you have individuals like Lenin and Stalin. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution was a little bit of a groundswell because if you know the history, I don't recall exactly where both Lenin and Stalin were exiled. I think Lenin went to Switzerland. I'm not sure. But the irony here is that even when the Bolshevik leaders did, and obviously Lenin came to the fore, it didn't really turn into that true democratic state because they thought only the intellectual elite could really lead something along this line, right? So it had to be something done from above. Now, he abolished free enterprise, and that approach was much more bureaucratic, though, than Marx probably would have envisioned. But they had to retain their ideology. Now, they would define this as a doctrine or their belief that supports or justifies, the economic and political domination of one class over another. So critical theorists here wanted to preserve their truth or their cultural ideas, but also exposed the ideological veneer. And Marx wasn't properly attentive to all those subtle psychological dynamics that kept that tenacious hold on the masses. Freud is the one that can offer that insight. So, if we know nothing more simply about Freud than the fact he promotes this pleasure principle. In other words, there's always these unrealized frustrations that we have from childhood. You probably heard terms like oral fixation, anal retentiveness, Oedipus complex, and such. So they were always working something out. So the child had learned to repress them. And you could, here too, think of the human person. You're seeing a transition from Kant's rational control of the individual, that was the Enlightenment ideal, to Freud's notion of repression, which also ultimately has to find a release. And even Freud, if you ever read his Civilization and its discontents, it doesn't put a lot of hope in the individuals in society are going to be able to do that, nonetheless. And if I had more time, we could even talk a little bit about Erich Fromm, who only died in 1980 or a little bit later. And he was one of the first of Frankfurt School to really appreciate Freud's insights into how and why workers, these proletariats, why were they willing to participate in producing surplus that they never got? In other words, why weren't they ticked off in these capitalistic practices? Because he thought it would go against their own self-interest. Well, Freud's pleasure principle at least offered insight to Fromm on that. So the immediate gratification, the pleasure principle, didn't leave us as the rational beings that were thought prior. And because we were irrational and never revolting against that complacency, in other words, this is the answer. The reason why the proletariat never revolted was that the fact that they were dealing with it as complacent people in society, that equaled the substitute of the gratification that they were trying to work out since they were quite young, or let's say the unrealized frustrations from childhood. Now, this was also very anti-religious and materialistic because religion fit this critique, right? Because especially if you want to talk about what is the substitute gratification and why would you put up with things now, well, if religion offers you a blissful afterlife, then that's part of the problem. So that needed to be discarded. So for Fromm, Erich Fromm, the voluntary domination of others, that's explained by this latent surrogate father representation. In other words, we have this projection of fatherness onto the people who are oppressing us, and even when a father is mean to us, he must be respected and obeyed. Anyway, that's Freud. Now, I didn't mention Horkheimer there. The idea of critical theory, at least defined by Horkheimer, is that it has to have those three elements. So everything that you hear today of critical theory, whatever form it takes, it has to be explanatory. Why are things like they are? It has to be practical. This is what you do. And it has to be normative. And normative has an ethical component to it. So if you need to know the distinction between normative and non-normative, non-normative would simply to say that her hair is long. Normative would be an ethical judgment saying, I don't like long hair. All right? So it has to be explanatory, practical, and it has to have an ethical component to it. All right. A couple more thinkers here. Thank you for hanging on because I know there's a lot that gets thrown in here. Theodore Adorno, he was disillusioned with this whole failed predictions of Marx, thinking that the bourgeois would collapse. So, he too found in Freud that these ideological forces were really, I should say, deeply entrenched in a person's psychological development. So, reason for him always seemed to be at odds with moral idealism. Now, if you want to read something of his, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, it was never translated in English into the 70s. So he spoke of how the film industry and the newspaper industry and they're controlling arms of advertising, right? And this is all what underlies the consumer basis of capitalism. So that's the new public square, where in the Enlightenment, they thought that the public square would be the rational debate, but now it's all controlled by the film and newspaper industry, and its manipulative consumption always encourages nothing from us except passivity. And there's something to that. I don't think Adorno was necessarily wrong on that. Herbert Mancusi, is an important figure in the Frankfurt School. He came to critique this whole bureaucratic notion of how things were progressing. And he held that the aim of critical theory, he says, was to make the establishment language speak what it conceals or excludes and denounces. If you want it said plainly, he said you need to stop speaking the language of the masters who controls them. I think a very popular work of his in regard to this would be known as the one-dimensional man. Anyway, this is the influence of the systematic underlying effect, right? So he states, like, why the masses cannot be taken at face value. It's not because they lie. But he says, because the universe of thought and practice in which they live is nothing more than the universe of manipulated contradictions, right? So, for example, if we only have the illusion of free choice, if you want a really clear-cut version of how that's applied, in the last presidential election, it could be that there were many people who didn't really care for any of those two candidates. They might have voted for one, which in a sense makes it like they had a free choice, but they only had the two to choose from. So was it really free and was it really rational? All right. Now, to try to wrap this all up, if you feel that there in our culture that there is a real pushback against all things Western, you can probably start to make some connections now. The Frankfurt School and its views of critical theory, and its let's say its adverseness towards capitalism, and the West was associated with capitalism. You're now going to see capitalism sort of merge into this view of Western civilization as a whole. And this is by the post-war era of the United States, right? Adorno and Horkheimer, they saw this whole transition with critical theory was much more of a critique, not of this capitalism, but of Western civilization, which embodied the bourgeois consciousness, if you want to say, and with his domination of so much, being swallowed up all of the human person. Now, I'm only going to mention postmodernism here because it's not exactly part of critical theory, but you're going to find people, there is postmodern critical theory and such, but there's people who are going to hold something in regards to both of these. So critical theory and postmodernism, without conflating the two, we don't want to lose their distinction. You often find that in like YouTube videos and such today. I at least want to say that there are some basic notions, and the basic notions is one is they deny foundationalism. So you have to hear it in terms of anti-foundationalism. So just real simply, foundationalism be that thing that's handed on. So what do we hand on? Well, we live within worldviews, right? These grand narratives. We call them meta-narratives. They deny that there is any meta-narrative or any grand worldview. I know people in postmodernism would think that it's too quick to say that it culminates in relativism. I'm going to leave it there. I think the argument can be made pretty well, but I won't do it now. The other issue with postmodernism is essentialism, but absolutely anti-essentialism. So there is no nature to a thing. So it's going to have much more of a view of constructed nature or perhaps social kinds. And we've covered both of those, so I won't go into those. But as opposed to something that has a nature which is immutable, it never changes, here you're going to have more of an identity of truth, or let's say an identity as truth, right? So what happens in all of this is that you have a disappearance of meaning. Where do you get meaning from if I don't have a meta-narrative or an inherited worldview? So there's nothing to mediate the truths, because the truths, quite frankly, are often placed in certain identities. So historical stories, right? If you see a lot of pushback on revisionism and such, and there's nothing wrong with correcting, over idolized figures in the past, but if you see a lot of pushback on historical notions, it's because these historical stories are simply nothing more than tools within cultures to support the status quo. So we have to reconstruct those, and so we only care about the historical ideas in terms of what they mean to us now, rather than to accept them on their face value or even to try. I'll leave it at that. So they're always questioning assumptions, which isn't bad in itself, but they're doing so within a framework that really overlaps no overarching worldview, so you have nowhere to ground yourself. Now, of this school of thought is Michel Foucault. Now, he limits what knowledge can be formed, let's say it this way. He limits that knowledge can only be formed to specific cultural views of particular times in history. So, knowledge is culturally bound. This means that epistemic conditions, if you want to call them that, they're always bound to historical knowledge claims. So we know more of Immanuel Kant being restrained by the limits of reason. Now everything is going to be determined by power. So the focus for Foucault is that discourse and power are the two factors that always determine knowledge. And then with that, empirical sciences, so even mathematics and logic, they could become nothing more than vehicles of the establishment. And they're always suspect, and because if they're going to continue this, hegemony, then they have to be questioned and also ferreted out. Now, you've often heard the phrase that knowledge is power. It's typically maybe understood that those with more knowledge have more power. But here it's going to be more, or let's say better understood, that those who are in power can determine what is or is not knowledge. Now, typically when you hear we're always looking at conflicts between groups and how there are power structures between those. That's quite Foucaultian. But the power is not a top-down power. This power still has this hegemonic view from the bottom up. If you want a simple, benign example of this, it would be like what is or is not cool in society. We don't typically determine what is not cool, and we don't think that we are slaves to trying to be cool, but we also typically try to dress and act in ways that fall in line with this cultural status quo. All right? So there's always these, so you get there, the knowledge conditions, and there's always these power conditions, and then those power conditions themselves will, say, determine knowledge. And though I don't have him up here, Jacques Derrida, who's another famous deconstructionist, found it impractical and impossible, to establish a conclusion by rational means. I only mention it because, well, let me wrap it up here, and then I'll give you sort of an end view of this. So even with this perhaps superficial connection between critical theory and postmodernism in general, the public became aware of both of these only through academia. I mean, maybe you might have heard of critical race theory if you were a lawyer in the 70s or going through law school in the 70s and such. But the academia brought these things to the fore in the 1970s, especially the 80s and such, and it was only in the last 5 or 6 years that I heard anything about these on the news, and likely you too. So it's really impossible to speak of critical theory and all of its offshoots. It's too broad. But there are, what I tried to offer was the underpinnings of all of these things, what would be necessary to apply these. So if we want to call them precedent manifestations or offshoots, there's, feminist critical theory, queer critical theory, race critical theory, post-colonial critical theory, postmodern critical theory. There's disability critical theory, cultural critical theory. Now, what they do, at least we can say, all share, right? Besides their considerations for justice and happiness, but they're going to be understood in the way that individuals, or at least groups of individuals, might understand those, is that the idea of materialism, right? So this is like an offshoot of the Enlightenment ideal. But this materialism as an offshoot of the Enlightenment ideal still remains bound to this, critical theory's Marxist roots, because remember, Hegel was that link there. So, logically from this then, you have a view of the human person who is always situated against some exterior structure of power. So it's impossible for an individual to see themselves in some sort of natural state, because even Freud didn't quite think that the individual had the rational capabilities to be forming a democratic society. And the other thinkers also, too, thought that, well, again, it's a little bit of an extreme example here, but even Lenin, after the Bolshevik Revolution, thought that there had to be some authority over the masses who could not govern themselves and such. So the human person is always understood. It's against this underlying structure that's always thwarting emancipation. And then finally, this sense of development maintains always an exterior revolutionary focus, where society has to be adapted. So it's not like a virtue theory that tries to form the individual to be something. It's an emancipatory approach that has to overcome something. So if you want to think about it, it's more of knocking down a wall. It doesn't. It's not a theory that's set up to what should be there and replace. So you will always hear that we have to dismantle this or that in order to create equity or equality, something in that regard. So anyway, you know, critical theory is not diametrically opposed to the goals of justice, even from a theistic point of view. Perhaps even that of Catholic social teaching, though there are some issues in here, because that also doesn't apply that they just mesh appropriately, particularly with an anthropology, what this human person is. So I'll stop on that, and I'll just say this, that if the human person is, and understanding the human person is first and foremost, so we'll call that the philosophical anthropology, and then that human person forms a family. And whatever we construct or view this family as, that then is a microcosm of society overall. So, in other words, you're always starting with what is this human person, and the human person then joins in a familial relation, and that familial relation is a microcosm of society. In a world where there's metaphysics and objective meaning, then there'd be objective meaning and natures to the person and thus to the family and society. It's not uncommon for individuals today in some postmodern notions to say that we don't have a metaphysics, so they don't look for the particular worldview, or they don't believe that there is one. But you can't really have no metaphysics. That's almost like saying all of us. There's five of us over here, and none of us belong to a group. So we are the group that doesn't belong to a group. You almost become a group just simply by the fact that you are forming something of like mind. So if somebody says they have no metaphysics, no meta-narrative, no worldview, what you really have is a poor metaphysics. And then from that poor metaphysics, everything is filtered through it, and it's going to leave you with more subjective meaning, which some people prefer. So there's a lot here that could be brought together. I'm sorry for the length of this, but nonetheless, I hope that you skimming through it at least gave you some insights into what critical theory was and how it helps us understand another view of the human person.